Hello, we're ready now to start the material. This is going to be the material from Chapter 1. If you've looked at the textbook, you know that most of Chapter 1 deals with Native Americans and the background to the settlement of North America. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Native American history. I actually have done some research of my own on Native Americans, not ones that are relevant to the class, because my research had dealt with some Native Americans here in California. I published articles about Native American groups in California. But that's not what this class covers. This class will cover and will start with English settlement of what is now the United States that begins in 1607. This class is designed to cover simply that, not because it's better, not because it's more important. There were other people who were settling in North America or settling in the Western Hemisphere that were not English. There were non-English people. There were English settlements in places other than what is now the United States. The English actually had settlements earlier in what is now the Caribbean and some of the West Indies islands had English settlements before the English started to settle North America. There are a lot of other things that we could cover, and we could cover the history of Native Americans. And I think that's a very important subject. I find it very interesting myself. I don't know that much about the Native Americans that were in the areas that we studied during the time period that we cover. As I say, most of my work on Native Americans has been here in California, which we won't get to in this class. It's just not, so I won't be covering it. I'm not going to spend much time on it. But it's not because it's not important. And I would hope maybe at some time in your college career, before you finish graduation, that you'll have a chance to look at the history of Native Americans in North America. Maybe wouldn't be probably in a history class, because history classes require the use of written documents, and that's not really available for most Native American history. So it's more, a lot of times, the people who study Native American history are anthropologists or archaeologists or other people who use other disciplines, use other disciplinary methods to do the research and do the studies. It's very interesting, and I hope that maybe there would be a time when you could study the more about Native Americans. They've been an important part of American history. It's an important part of American culture. It's just not what this particular class covers. This class is going to cover the English, let's say, not because they're better, that's just because that's what this class covers. You also could study, I'll talk a little bit today briefly about the French and the Spanish. You could certainly spend a lot of time studying about the history of Spanish settlement in America. We do offer classes at this college in that, and at a time in my life, back when I was still working full-time, I did teach those classes. And we have we would study class of the whole history of the Americas, focused on Spanish American history, focused on Mexican history. This is a particular interest of mine, and as I say, I have taught it. It's been a long time since I last taught the history of Spanish America. As a retiree, that's not been part of my teaching load, so I haven't taught that for many years. But it's a particular interest of mine. I have a particular interest in the history of Mexico. I do have family ties to Mexico, and so personally I'm very interested in the history of Mexico and Mexican affairs today. But I'm not going to use much of that, because that's not what this class covers. It's another class, and you might want to take, I think it's History 5 that has been offered by the college, and if you don't take it here, maybe sometimes, as I say, if you go to a four-year school and you've got an option, or you could take a class, I'd recommend that you take a history of Mexico, a history of Latin America, or history of Canada, history of French America. There's a lot of interesting things out there to study, and and they're fascinating things. It's just not what we cover. That's not the definition of this class. But as a little bit of a background, I want to spend some time today talking about Native Americans. Native American history is extremely complex because there were a very large number of Native American cultures. And a lot of times people like to generalize about them and say, oh, the Indians did this, the Indians did that. Well, you've got to be very careful about that sort of thing because there were so many diverse Indian cultures that it's very hard to generalize because there's a wide range of cultures, some very different from each other, and what applies to one group has no relevance to another group. So it's very hard to make generalizations that have any validity with the wide diversity of Native American cultures. But a brief note, just as a brief background, among the multitude of Native American cultures, there were three that were probably the most advanced, the most sophisticated, and the largest parts of the totality of Native American culture. Those three peoples were what we call the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayans. The Aztecs were in what is now Mexico. The Mayans were in Mexico and then over into Guatemala. The Incas were down in South America in the Mayan region of running from Chile and Peru and Ecuador. Those three cultures, especially the Mayans, or especially the Aztecs and the Incas, were highly sophisticated cultures. They had very large numbers of people. There were millions of people in each of those empires. They had very advanced technological civilizations. Their science was very sophisticated. In some ways, some of the Aztec astronomy and other science was more advanced than any Europeans at that time or other people around the world. They had very sophisticated religions, very complex religions. Aztec religion is extremely complicated, trying to understand the intricacies of a very sophisticated intellectual structure for trying to understand the nature of the universe that was accessible by religion. And they had very advanced political structures. They had large empires with emperors. The imperial structure was again very complex. The different layers from the emperor to lower level officials and on down and to the common people. The emperor, the Aztec emperor, ruled maybe 30 million people as an almost absolute ruler through a very sophisticated system of control and administration, and they had a great deal of power, a great deal of wealth. The Aztec cities of Tenochtitlan on the site of modern-day Mexico City was, as of 1500, approximately when the Europeans arrived and discovered it, it may have been the most glorious city in the world. It had maybe even was more advanced, more glorious than Rome. Rome at one time had been the center of much of European culture, but by 1500 Rome was very much in decay. Many of the magnificent temples and other structures had deteriorated or were in ruins. But the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan had temples and and structures and wealth and affluence that probably exceeded any other city in the world. So this was an obvious lure for Europeans. When they first saw this, they were just overwhelmed by the grandeur and the glory of Tenochtitlan, with hundreds of thousands of people living and supported by a whole structure of a very complex Aztec empire. And similar situations for the Incas. The Mayans are a little bit more complicated, but I won't get into the details, but those were all very, very advanced civilizations. They all had large numbers of people. They had very extensive agricultural operations to support an urban population. They had large cities, and the food and other supplies funneled in from the agricultural settlements into the city to support an urban population. And they were, excuse me, very complex, very sophisticated, functioning empires with an emperor, a single emperor at the top, governing this whole body, this whole structure. By contrast, the Native Americans of what is now the United States were much less sophisticated, much less advanced, not nearly as complex as the civilizations of the three great empires to the south. And within the very simple societies of what is now the United States, probably the simplest and the least developed, the least sophisticated, was that in California. But the Indians of now modern day United States basically did not have metallurgy. They had not yet mastered metallurgy, so they had no metallic implements, and specifically they did not have gold artifacts. The Aztecs and other Indians in South America had mastered gold technology. They knew how to mine gold, they knew how to refine it, and they used gold for many of their artifacts. They used gold for decoration of their buildings. They had all sorts of gold statues and so forth. The Indians of the United States had no gold, even though ironically, probably something like a third of all of the gold on the planet was here in California, but the Indians of California had not learned how to mine it. They had not learned how to refine it or make it into implements, so there were no gold implements in California, despite the fact that that the natural deposits of gold of California are very, very substantial. But no Indians anywhere in what is now the United States had really mastered not only gold but other metals. They were not used to doing that. They didn't know how to do that, and that was not a part of their culture. A lot of times anthropologists call these people hunter-gatherers. That's a term that defines their culture. They hunted for much of their sustenance, and then they gathered it. The Indians of California had not yet mastered agriculture. Indians of the eastern part of the United States, the ones that we will encounter in our study of history here, they had developed agriculture. They raised a wide range of agricultural products in villages. They raised a wide range of vegetables, and they raised corn. They had learned how to raise corn somehow, probably from the Aztecs, but that was a big part of their culture, or their way of life, and so they were engaged in agriculture. They did not have any major cities. Most of the Indian habitat was very simple, very basic. Indians of the East used trees and so forth to make very simple little cabins. Indians of the Great Plains had learned to hunt buffalo, and they would use buffalo hides for almost everything, for their housing and so forth. But they didn't have major cities. A lot of times the settlements were not very permanent. They would move frequently. They could simply tear down or just abandon some housing and move to another site if necessary. Some of them were highly migratory, some less so. The plains of the Indians of the part of what is now the western United States, as a generalization, were very migratory. They would live one place and then move somewhere else. They would take their housing with them, or they would just abandon and build new stuff. It was real easy to build a house, and so they'd start over again from new sites. So their settlement patterns were very simplistic, very basic, very close to nature, and they were very much involved in living with nature, because basically everybody was a farmer or a hunter or both, and they didn't have big structures like the Aztecs. I mean, the Aztecs they had this great religion. They had a large number of priests. Aztec priests were a very important part of the civilization. Indians of the United States, what is now the United States, had very simplistic religions. They didn't have a big priestly class. They would have, oftentimes, many of the common features were shamans, who would be sort of quasi-religious leaders, but would also be sort of healers, kind of medical people. Generally, they didn't have big chiefs. It's a little misleading to speak of an Indian chief for most of what is now the United States. They would have kind of governing councils of prominent people, but they were very democratic. Sort of everybody was part of the governing council. There might be one person who would be sort of in charge, but his power was very limited, and he served only at the pleasure of the community. It's not like the Aztecs, where you've got an emperor with a big structure of military people and administrators and bureaucrats who administer the whole operation of the empire. North American Indians had very casual, easygoing kind of administrative structures, and they didn't really think of themselves as a tribe. They didn't think of themselves as some sort of formal organization. They're just people. Many of the North American Indians didn't have a name for themselves. They didn't have a name for their tribe or their organization. They didn't have a sense of being a tribe or an organization. The word that they used for themselves is just the people. We're just the people. That's it. We're just all human beings. We're all living here in nature, and trying to get by as best we can, find enough food to eat and to survive, and just have a very simple life. When the Europeans found America, they discovered that it had been there all along. When they found it, they, of course, immediately encountered the Native Americans. And they had different ways to react to that. So what I want to do today is look at what we'll start today with what the Spanish and the French did as part of their interaction with Native Americans. And then next week we'll look at, and we'll really start with what this class is going to focus on, We'll start then with the English. Now the Spanish came to their first encounter really was with the Native Americans that they called the Aztecs, that called themselves. That's not really the name of the people. They're the Mexica, but within the Mexica, the warriors were the Aztecs, and that's who the Spanish encountered. So they thought they were the Aztecs, and they were just absolutely overwhelmed, as I said, by the splendor and the grandeur and the obvious wealth of Tenochtitlan and other parts of the Aztec Empire. The Spanish discovered that, first of all, there was a lot of gold there. And that was obviously something that they took a great deal of interest in, because for Europeans, gold was the measure of wealth. Money was gold. So the Spanish saw all of this gold decorating temples and statues and various decorations around the city of Tenochtitlan and other parts of the Aztec Empire, and they just went berserk. They said, we gotta have this gold. And so they started gathering up the gold. They conquered the Aztecs. That's a complicated story. I won't get into the details. But they established themselves as in power over the emperor, and then by being in power over the emperor, they could be in power over the entire Aztec Empire. They had millions of people at their control by controlling the emperor, Moctezuma. And they started then looting the empire of all of its gold and destroying all sorts of other features of Aztec art and culture. And they took the gold back to Europe, and because they found so much gold, Spain became, by the early 16th century, by far the wealthiest and most powerful country in Europe, because they had all that gold that they were able to steal from the Aztecs. And that certainly was an interest. Now, sometimes students then think that the Spanish Empire was based on gold. Well, gold was very important, but only because there was so much of it there. Now, when we start looking at the English, we'll find out that the Indians of North America, the Indians of what is now the United States, as I told you, did not have gold. They hadn't learned how to get it, and in the East, it wasn't there. The gold is out here in California, in the western part of what is now the United States. So there was no gold. Well, it isn't like that the Spanish wanted gold and the English didn't. It was just that where the Spanish went, there was gold. So that was, they were obsessed with that. If the Indians of the eastern United States had gold in the same way that the Aztecs did, the English would have been very interested in it. They would have taken it. They would have based their empire on gold just as much as the Spanish did. But that wasn't really what the Spanish based their empire on. They just took that because it happened to be there. They based their empire on Indian labor. There were millions of Aztec people who the Spanish subjugated and turned them into laborers. They forced labor. And the Spanish came over, established big estates. It's very complicated. The rules changed over time. To simplify it, we can call them haciendas. They established these huge haciendas where they had, on one hacienda, they had hundreds or thousands of Aztecs working, of Indian workers, raising cattle, raising other agricultural products. In some places, yes, mining gold. If that was around, probably more often they would mine silver. There was more silver left in the ground in Mexico than gold, so they established silver mines in many parts of Mexico, and had Indians working there. Indians were forced to labor for the Spanish, and that's what the Spanish Empire was about: was forcing Indians to work for them. That's in a simple sentence. That's the basis of the Spanish Empire. Now, a lot of times people then use the word slavery. They say that the Spanish enslaved the Indians. Well, some of that depends on your definition of the word slavery. And in this class, I'm going to be very precise about using the word slavery. And it's just to keep things straight. It's just for academic purposes. When I talk about slavery, I'm going to be using it in the way that it became established in Anglo-America. The English established slavery. The Spanish did not. Now that's just a matter of semantics, a matter of just using the word slavery the way that I want to use it. And it's just to keep it straight. The key feature of slavery, as it was eventually established by the Anglos, was that slaves were property. And that was an important thing. Slaves were property. And throughout the whole history of slavery, which is going to be a big issue in this class, we're going to be talking about it a lot. You can't study American history without studying slavery. You can't study American history without studying racism. It's a part of this country. It's what has been making this country distinctive for forever, since the very earliest days. The key feature of slavery in North America, where I'm going to use the word slavery, was that slaves were property. The Spanish were not allowed to view Indians as slaves in that meaning of the word. They were not allowed to view them as property. They were people. Now, the Spanish forced those people to work. They mistreated them. They abused them. They did not treat them as equals. They did not give them any what we would call rights. They were very abusive, and the Indian population under Spanish rule declined drastically. It was the Spanish settlement of what is now Mexico was a disaster for the Mexica, for what we call the Aztecs. The population just went away because of the abuse by the Spanish and also by diseases that they introduced from Europe. But the reason the Spanish did not view Indians as property was because the monarchs of Spain, the people who ran the country, insisted that they had to be their subjects, that the Indians were subjects of the monarchs, and they would not allow their subjects to be treated as property. They had to be viewed as people. And that meant that they were there only. The Spanish said, from the standpoint of the monarchs, the official rule was the whole purpose of the Spanish settlement of North America, of America, was to convert the Indians to Christianity. And so the church theoretically would insist that Indians had to be treated as people. They could be treated as low-class people, they could be treated as forced laborers, but they had to be treated as human beings, which meant specifically that they had to be converted to Catholicism, to Christianity. That meant they had to be baptized, and that meant that when young boys and girls got together and did what boys and girls do or did, they had to get married. And so this is part of being a Spanish subject. You're theoretically a Christian, you go to church, you get baptized, you go through the whole rite of religion. Now, frankly, a lot of times it was done more in name than reality. A lot of times the religious leaders of the Spanish Empire did not really do a very good job. They didn't stick by the rules. They just did it in very perfunctorily. And they, okay, well, you're baptized, and that's that. And then they just went out and abused them. A lot of times the priests were themselves abusers of Indians. But technically, there was that distinction. Indians were laborers. They were not property. They were not an asset. They were not a form of wealth. So that was the basis of the Spanish Empire, and their empire depended upon Indian labor. Now the French came to what is now Canada, and they found there that one of the important resources that was available in Canada and parts of down into upstate New York and all the way down into the Ohio Valley, they discovered that an important resource there were fur-bearing animals. And those fur-bearing animals were highly desired in Europe because their furs could be used to make clothing in Europe. It's very cold in Europe and in the wintertime. And Europeans had learned how to make wool clothing and so forth, but they discovered that fur coats, fur hats, fur implements were much warmer than anything that they could make out of wool. So there was a tremendous demand for fur in Europe. So the French came over and began trading for Indian captured fur. The Indians would go out and capture the animals, skin them and so forth, and then the French would take the furs and they would take them back to Europe where they could make a very substantial profit because of the tremendous demand for fur in Europe. And what made this work was that the French brought for trade something that the Indians highly valued, and that was metal implements. I told you the Indians did not themselves know how to make metal objects. They found that the Europeans, the French, could bring with them axes, knives, arrowheads, shovels, all sorts of implements made out of iron that were far superior to anything that they could make themselves with the technology that they had, which was pre or non-metallurgical. So you've got a situation where people in Europe really wanted the furs, people in America really wanted the iron implements and all the other things that you make out of iron, and so it's a natural for trade to take place, and the French were the people who carried on that trade. So the basis of the French Empire in America was the fur trade. Now the French also had attitudes that the Indians are going to be their partners in trade. They oftentimes abused the Indians, but they also insisted on viewing them as people. French missionaries were an important part of the whole French Empire in America, as Spanish missionaries were an important part of the Spanish Empire. And the French missionaries also insisted that Indians had to be treated as humans. They had to become Christians, and that was the whole point, was to make them Christians. And so they insisted then that the Indians had to be baptized just like all other Christians. That if they want to have babies, it's okay to have babies, but before you do it, you're supposed to get married. And so the French insisted that Indians had to be part of Christian marriage. And for both Spain and France, a lot of the people who came from Europe were men. So they're looking for wives. They found them in the Indians. And so, I mean, it was just very common for European men, either French, both French and Spanish, to marry Indian women. The marriages had to be done according to Christian doctrine, according to Christian rules. You have to say the same things that you do in Europe. And then it's perfectly legitimate. I mean, those are Christian marriages. Their children are baptized, they're Christians, and it became very common. The Spanish word for this was mestizos, that I mean, that was a big part of Mexican culture, were mestizos, because the Europeans who came over were predominantly men, and so the only women, the only mothers available were Indians, and that just became a norm in both the Spanish and the French empires to have marriage between European men and American women, with the children then being called mestizos. So these are the ways that the Spanish and the French interacted with the Indians. They both found Indians were essential to their empires. Spanish relied on Indian labor. Without Indian labor, there was no Spanish Empire. I mean, the whole thing revolved around forced labor performed by Indians. Technically, but this is just a semantic thing, technically not slaves, but as I say, that's only because I want to use the word in a very precise way, and it doesn't apply to what the Spanish did with Indians. And for the French are not going to go out and kill the little animals. That's the job of Indians. They just trade for the furs. So both of those empires depended on the Indians, either as laborers in field and farm and factory or whatever, or as trappers of fur with which we'll trade. So the Indians were crucial to both of those two empires. Now we'll find out in next week's lecture that that's not true of the Indians. Now, as promised, here's your question on the lecture. You can submit an answer to this, as I say, at your discretion. Just write for me 1 or 2 words. What was the basis of the Spanish Empire in America? What was the basis of the Spanish Empire in America? Write a sentence or 2 and send it to me, and then I'll let you know if you get any points or not. Okay.